Protests in Bangladesh after more road deaths, with students demanding law changes. The government says political rivals are stirring up trouble ahead of an election. What's driving the public anger? And is it just about politics? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The deaths of two teenagers by a speeding bus in Dhaka has sparked days of protests in Bangladesh. Thousands of students have blocked roads and stopped traffic, demanding tougher penalties for those who cause accidents. The demonstrations turned violent when police fired tear gas and used water cannon. Dozens of students were injured. Journalists were also targeted. Human Rights Watch says groups linked to the ruling Awami League party attacked protesters with machetes and sticks. But the government denies its activists were involved. And on Monday, it promised to introduce the death sentence for deliberate road traffic deaths in an attempt to end the unrest. This is what some of the protesters have been saying.
We've been protesting on the roads for a few days. We're demanding justice for those students who were killed by a bus, and we want safe roads.
The country's elected representatives manage all their expenditures with our tax money. There's no benefit from elections if the representatives are ignorant about our life security and are reluctant to provide us due services. We will continue the movement if our demands are not met immediately.
They have beaten us with bamboo sticks, they kicked us, and they hurt us in other ways. But it won't affect me. We want safe roads. Whatever is happening, let it be. It's not a problem. We don't want anyone to be killed under the wheels of buses or vehicles in the future. This is what we want.
Police say they had to act to prevent attacks on the ruling party offices.
The protesters attacked party offices of Awami League several times yesterday. Today, 4 to 5 protesters tried to do the same. We prevented them at that time and asked them to go back, but they didn't. Then we fired tear gas shells to disperse them.
Police arrested an award-winning photographer, Shahidul Alam, who was covering the demonstrations. It's alleged he was also tortured. His detention came just hours after he did an interview with Al Jazeera on Sunday. We asked Bangladesh's information minister about Alam's case. He denies he was detained for his journalism.
He has been arrested on certain counts, which we are looking into it. But as such, today he will be produced to the court. The court will decide what will happen to him. But he has not been arrested on journalistic ground. He has been arrested for misusing the Information Communication Technology Act. So it is a general act for the general citizens, not for the journalists. So for journalistic endeavor, he has not been, or a different opinion, he has not been arrested. There are other reasons which will give a report to the court. We believe the free and unharassed press, and we think that the journalists should have the security to work on the spot, and they should not be harassed by the law enforcing agency or by any quarters. The government give protection to them.
All right, let's now go to our guests. Joining us in London, Charu Latahog, an Associate Fellow of Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House. In Colombo, via Skype, Omar Waraish, Deputy South Asia Director at Amnesty International. And also in London, David Bergman, a journalist who was formerly based in Bangladesh for 13 years. Welcome to you all. Charu, I want to start with you today. Look, many have said that these protests are about far more than just road safety or traffic. What, in your view, are the issues that led to these demonstrations?
I think the fact remains that Bangladesh has been besieged by an idea that dissent has been suppressed for too long. A questioning of the government is something that is not being tolerated. And let's bear in mind that it's both sides. It's all factions, all political parties across the board. Currently, we have the Awami League, which is trying to bring in what is called the Digital Security Act, a hugely draconian piece of legislation which would seek to suppress and undermine the media. So I think we're seeing this sort of widespread protest by students in the light of a lot that is going on within the country in terms of freedom of expression, suppression of dissent, and therefore has to be viewed as such.
Omar, do you agree with what Charu was saying there? I mean, no matter who is in power in Bangladesh, do you believe that there is no space that has been created for the expression of dissent or freedom of expression in general?
Yes, the space for civic space has been dramatically under attack and being restricted by successive governments. And that actually leads to things like the protests, where people feel that actually they have to assert themselves on the streets to be taken seriously, to have their demands heard, that there are no easier avenues by which their dissent can be heard in Bangladesh. And that's been a space that's been under attack offline for a very long time. And as we're seeing, it's been under attack online as well in more recent years.
David, just how much of these protests embarrassed the government of the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina?
Well, it seems to have embarrassed the government quite significantly. I think one has to look at the protests in the context of the fact that very little dissent is allowed in Bangladesh at the moment. The government has over a number of years been very able to restrict significantly the ability of the political opposition for maintaining any sense of ability to be in opposition. There have been huge numbers of arrests, there have been disappearances, there have been extrajudicial killings, and there are countless people in detention at the moment. So the opposition finds it very difficult to be able to operate. There are elections coming, and in that context, the government, having been very able to have restricted the opposition, suddenly see the students being able to freely protest. And I think that concerns them a lot, because they're not quite sure whether or not they can control it, and indeed whether or not other political forces may take it over. So in that context, I think we have to understand why the police and the youth wing of the government party decided to take a very repressive steps to stop these protests.
Charu, the opposition has been accused by the government of fomenting anger. They've been accused of manipulating the protesters, the students that were out there in the streets, to try to serve their agenda. Just how founded are these accusations, in your opinion?
To be fair, you know, at this point we have the Awami League, which is putting across these accusations about the opposition party, the BNP, a large number of whose party workers have been put in arrest by this government as well. The fact remains that, there is gross impunity in the country. Corruption is widespread. Licenses are issued willy-nilly and without any adherence to the fact whether those who earn the licenses actually deserve them in the first place. So the basis for these protests is a very legitimate one. What further serves to embarrass the government and causes them to hurl these accusations about these protests is the fact that you have young students out on the streets. You know, the government is in a very vulnerable position as far as, it has to sort of, to continue add strength to the argument that this is somehow opposition fuel, because otherwise what is the legitimacy of a government which is now being so severely and strongly opposed by a young population, a student population? You know, a majority of them could be under 18. So the fact that the government says that these are somehow supported by the opposition may have a degree of truth to it, but the fact is that the situation in Bangladesh for many years has been very polarized and politically, all form of protest is somehow politically triggered and led. Student bodies are linked to political parties, so politics is very much entrenched into public life in Bangladesh.
Omar, I want to get back in a minute to the issue of the polarization going on in Bangladesh. But first, I want to talk specifically about the case of Shahidul Alam, of course, the very renowned photographer. He was arrested. He was charged under Section 57 of Bangladesh's Information Communications Technology Act, which I believe Charu referred to a few minutes ago. Now, human rights group, including your group, has called this a draconian law used to stifle the media and political dissent. Can you tell us more about Shahidul Alam's case and also this law and how it has been enforced?
So one of the last things that Shahidul Alam did before he was detained was appear on this channel. And he gave an interview where he made very critical comments about the government, comments that alarmed the authorities in Bangladesh because there is no space to offer such dissent within the country, and the very few Bangladeshis who would do that. He was covering the protests himself, during the course of which he was attacked. His camera was smashed by vigilantes linked to the ruling party from the Bangladesh Chatra League. And he was broadcasting live from the protests as well. He made a number of comments on Facebook, and those are what's landed him in trouble. Now, this Section 57 is actually a law that the government itself has conceded is problematic and is flawed. And yet they persist with its use. It's being used to punish bloggers, to accuse them of blasphemy and charge them under it. It's being used against journalists who've covered protests, for example, of textile workers. It's being used against ordinary Facebook users, for example, when they've made comments about the Prime Minister and her family. It's a very vague and broad and coercive law that can be used by a government to punish dissent that it simply does not like. It needs to go. The troubling thing is that when the Bangladeshi government has sought to move beyond it and replace it with the Digital Security Act, that law is flawed as well, inherently so. So I think a big part of this has been over the recent years, since 2013 at least, is the use of repressive laws to shut down dissent within the country.
David, we should take this opportunity to mention that your wife is defending Shahidul Alam. But I want to ask you, you specifically having worked as a journalist in Bangladesh for so long, how is the climate right now in Bangladesh towards journalists? Is it deteriorating, and how much has it deteriorated in recent years?
It's always difficult to compare era to era. I mean, when the Bangladesh Nationalist Party was in power and when the military was in power, there has been censorship of the media. But I think that journalists now do think this period is as bad as it has ever been. I mean, there is significant censorship that takes place. It's a lot of self-censorship, simply because they know that if they cross the line, there will be repercussions. A couple of years ago, the Military Intelligence Agency stopped all major corporations from advertising with two of the country's biggest newspapers because they didn't like an article that was published in it. The television is significantly, apart from being owned by individuals who are business colleagues of the governing party or who support the governing party, they are also very highly restricted, even more so than the newspapers. So things are extremely difficult, critical things that people want to say. You do not see that in newspapers or on television anymore, or very rarely. And that is why I think what Shahidul said on the Al Jazeera network in his interview was quite significant, because it was very bold and it talked about Bangladesh in very plain language that many people would talk about privately but never publicly. And I think that the government was concerned not only that Shahidul didn't ever knows that he ought not to say those things again, but other people also independently minded as he is and impartial and not politically partisan, that they also know that there are significant repercussions if they speak out.
Charu, a few minutes back you mentioned just how polarized Bangladesh is currently. Why is that? Why is society there so deeply divided?
I think, I mean, there needs to be a more historical look at the way Bangladesh has evolved politically, and also the manner in which democracy has evolved in Bangladesh post its separation, its liberation, independence in 1971. The fact that it was the military regime, followed by two successive leaders who alternated in power, developed a very personality-driven cult around and a personality-driven political culture, which was rife with political protest, very personal slandering, the environment of corruption, the fact that the personality-driven nature of the politics meant that it was always one against the other, ensured that the division within Bangladeshi politics became deeper and deeper, and in that mix has been this constant tension between what really is the identity of Bangladesh as a nation, whether it rests on its Bengali tradition or on its or on Islam as being an important and component part of the way politics has evolved. And in more recent years, the litigation and the prosecutions of those who played a role in the liberation war has further sort of created a messy mix of political culture. So I think it's a nation which is sort of as like many other countries, is that constantly at war with itself, and it's never had a stable, mature, secure a look at its internally, which is more secular and evolved. So I think it's a mixture of things which have to be viewed as a totality, rather than sort of one particular character, one individual. We've seen over the years that neither of the political parties which have remained in power have managed to steer the country in a secular, democratic manner, which is respectful of rights and has enabled the creation of an honest critique and civil society space. Neither has done that.
Charu,
That's just caused the polarization to continue.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just that I want to ask David to pick up on something you were saying. David, Charu was talking, about political movements within Bangladesh. Now, do you believe the country is at a unique political moment right now? And because the demonstrators continue to come out day after day, do these protesters feel in any way right now that they have a bit of the upper hand?
Well, I wouldn't say that the protests themselves indicate that the country is at that significant a point. I mean, the country is moving towards a point where there are going to be elections. And that is a very sensitive arena for the current government, because they very much want to win those elections, and people believe that they will win them by hook or by crook. And that is why, to some extent, they're very concerned about the student protests themselves, that they don't get out of hand or are used politically in a way that could destabilize the government at the moment.
Omar, Bangladeshi officials have said that if allegations that protesters or journalists were beaten, that if those allegations are proven, then those who had perpetrated those crimes, that they will go on trial. Do you believe that that could actually happen?
Well, I hope some action is taken. Sadly, we haven't got much of a precedent to go on here. But I'm very glad that the Bangladeshi authorities are open to the fact that there are people who attack a largely peaceful demonstration, they attack journalists, and that the rule of law must stand for them. I mean, if they're looking for evidence, you can just go down what was Shahidul's timeline, and you could see images of his broken camera. There are students that we've spoken to who were injured very badly. There were journalists we've spoken to who have been injured. it would be a very, very welcome development if action is taken against them. Because so far, we've seen the authorities and their auxiliaries in the form of this pro-government students' union being unleashed to punish the students who exercise their human rights by peacefully taking to the streets to voice their demands.
Charu, the government is also promising to consider road safety reforms to address the students' concerns. They're also reportedly considering imposing the death penalty in cases of deliberate road deaths. Is that bringing reassurance to those who were out in the streets demonstrating for so many days?
I think there's a great deal of disillusionment within Bangladesh with the ability of the government to truly respond. There needs to be some very serious example setting in terms of prosecutions and in terms of taking action against those who are guilty, and indeed sort of not only putting in place good legislative measures, but actually implementing them and ensuring that something is done about corruption, the widespread corruption which allows for, as I was mentioning before, the fact that people who are not illegally procure licenses and therefore if you go to the heart of what happened with this particular protest was the killing of these two students, and the reason why such incidents can go unpunished. And I think there needs to be some serious example setting before the government can actually convince the people of their good intent and sway this massive public opinion which is rising against them. So yes, perhaps there could be potential. It's a very emotional time at the moment in Bangladesh, but some serious measures could perhaps build strong public opinion.
David, what does all this mean going into the elections? How does this play out?
Well, I think it's important for the government that they get control over the situation, and that is why there have been two student protests this year. There's been an earlier one of university students who were protesting against the quotas for government jobs, and that was also quite a significant protest that got large numbers of people out onto the streets. And after some days, the government also then, or the Prime Minister then, appeared to cave in, although she hasn't actually taken the steps that she promised to do. But she caved in, and that diffused the protests. And the same thing is happening now. The government has appeared to take heed of the demands of these students and appears to have significantly diffused the demands. And I think that the numbers of students on the streets these days has reduced to very few. So, I mean, the government is obviously really tried to make sure that this doesn't get out of hand. As the elections come through, I mean, the issue is whether they're going to be free and fair elections. To what extent will there be? Will the opposition parties be able to properly campaign? To what extent will there be no vote rigging? These are really significant questions, and most is difficult to say, but a lot of people have very significant doubts whether the government is really committed to any free and fair elections. The Election Commission is not a strong independent body. The administration is highly politicized. The political parties at the moment can't function in any independent way. So it's difficult to see how in December or so, when the elections take place, that the people will get a free choice to vote. And to some extent, I mean, one shouldn't make these.
David, I'm sorry. David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's just that we're almost out of time. I want to throw one last question to Omar. Omar, from your vantage point, and we only have about a minute left, can we expect to see more protests going forward?
Well, I think elections are a tense time, and we may see people take to the streets again. It's important, though, that the government of Bangladesh, which actually has earned a lot of goodwill for its treatment of refugees over the past year, act responsibly, protect those rights, show the same commitment on its own streets as it has done to the Rohingya. Otherwise, these situations can get out of hand, and they can tarnish its reputation globally, as we're seeing now.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much to all our guests, Charu Latahog, Omar Waresh, and David Bergman. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.